Alright, this is a podcast on the recent interview between Brian Cox and Joe Rogan. Uh, so Joe Rogan has a lot of physicists and scientists and everything on his podcast. But I like to discuss the physicists because he doesn't seem to question them very much. So when Brian Cox was on, he was talking about the Higgs mechanism and how it's a mechanism for why mass is given to some particles and not others. And if you watch my previous podcast, I talk a lot about how theoretical science and theology create hidden causal mechanisms that just push the question back and add another thing to explain, because we're looking for an explanation for existence itself, not. So you can see if you invented a hidden being or hidden mechanism that excretes mass to the elementary particles, you're just adding another thing to explain. And Freeman Dyson, who's a physicist, just said something like negative about climate change models, how they're just adding in all these fudge factors, which I actually agree with. But the thing that was interesting about that is Freeman Dyson doesn't understand that that's what the standard model is too. I mean, come on. I mean, you don't get any asymmetry for free. Anything that you get out of the equations, you have to put into the equations. So it's almost like they're playing this self-deception. First of all, when you invent the Higgs mechanism, you're like reducing the three-family structure that they observe. And it doesn't really predict the masses either, even with all these fudge factors. It's predicting crude things. And so the problem with these hidden mechanisms is that they have a Zenos paradox that occurs. Because first of all, it's taken from a macroscopic example and then projected onto something that is not observable at all. We can only observe like the effects of something that might exist, might not exist. I argue that it doesn't exist, that they're just symbols, and that there's these pre-existential dispositions that are explaining existence. And at the bottom, it's hollow. But you can watch my other podcasts if you want to get into that. So no one's really ever understood anything. And I don't know how to explain that to people. It's because people are really biased to the familiarized authority. It's like they can't see past it. So another thing that he was talking about is like how a proton is in the Large Hadron Collider and its clock is slowed down, which would mean that its decay rate is slowed down. And then he says that that's because the accelerator appears like really small, like a few meters to the particle. And then he said something like, it seems to be like that. And he goes, no, I know it's like that. And then he had that little glitch because he has a little doubt there. He's like, understands that he's talking about something that's inconceivable. And that's what they're always talking about, something inconceivable, whether it has to do with Zenos Paradox, or whatever. And I like to add, I've talked about in previous podcasts how Einstein's perspectivism is not like a physical feature of reality. It's part of our perception. Like, we see relative contrasts because our perception is like that, not because the world is like that. And I've talked about how that violates the conservation of energy when they talk about relative motion, because it ignores the causal history of the particle. What else? He also talked about the multiverse idea. That's one thing where physicists try to artificially symmetrize existence so that they don't have to explain why there's sort of like these patterns and not other patterns. That goes back to what I was talking about in a few other podcasts about how there's no asymmetry for free. They know that. They ignore it in some cases, but when it suits their purposes, they don't ignore it. They try to do something like that. The problem with the multiverse idea with life, how they're talking about how every form of life, like in monkeys typing out Shakespeare, the problem with that is that no set of rigid laws would ever produce life. There's not an infinite number of variations for rigid laws. See, they're leaving out flexibility. That is, if you have a rigid electric law and you're trying to explain the daily routine of the cell, you're going to fail. You can't simulate it, you can't do anything. It wouldn't even produce one gene being transcribed. It wouldn't even set it up for a transcription of a gene. Because you just have rigid attractions and repulsions that can't be, there's no exception to them in their way of looking at things. So if you took like the 40 protein molecule that clamps down onto the DNA, and then it transcribes it with the RNA, and then it drags it over here and splices out or uses other 40 protein molecules like with motors to splice out the junk DNA and then paste back together the not junk DNA. It has no instructions for doing this also, like there's no molecular instructions. You think of how nuanced its movement has to be. Like every single little movement has to be in this way rather than any other way. So the probability of that happening with a rigid law is approximately 0. So if you think of the millions of movements that have to occur in one way rather than any other way, the cumulatively compounded improbability of that just goes approximately 0 times approximately 0, millions and millions of times just for one protein. For it to be folded, and then it has to be miraculously combined with other folded proteins. And it has to find them and go in the right shape, and then that has to go another place to be functional, and that has to happen for thousands of proteins every minute in every cell of every body that's ever existed, and it all happens seamlessly. That's the level of, it's very depressing. It's like, when I say no one understands what they're talking about, like, it's not even a little bit. It's like trillions of times too crude. Yeah. So, I think I skipped something. Back to when Brian Cox was talking about the proton, where its time is dilated in the accelerator, but the space looks to the proton as if it's like shorter, but there's no way to verify anything like that. They're not being empirical anymore. Even with the Higgs mechanism, they're not empirical. With even postulating that an atom exists, they're not being empirical. And they're talking about things that are zero-dimensional. These are things that you can say, but you can't mean. They should be asking not whether there's 11 dimensions or whether you can observe something zero-dimensional or one-dimensional. They should be asking, why can't I? And why is the world three-dimensional? They want to ignore reality and take you into this fantasy world. So really, theoretical science is no different from theology, except that one uses animated hidden causal mechanisms, which fall prey to Zenos Paradox, and like they just push the question back. And the same thing with the inanimate hidden mechanisms. What else? They also talked about not transhumanism, but AI. They're very similar, or they're connected. Just like I think there's a disposition to functionality that overrides the electric law, or electric pattern in the cell. I think of the brain as symbolically functional. That is, it doesn't even use a code. So it's not like it's sending a code from one nerve cell to the next, and then it's unpacked, and then it understands what it means, and it's combined with other codes that are unpacked, and it's all perfect and seamless, and everything knows to go to the right nerve cell. It's doing that, but it's doing it in a fake sort of way. Like, it's sending one pulse, and it has no code. It's just a symbol of what a code might be, and that all the information is actually not stored anywhere. It's all pre-existentially dispositional. I mean, we access our memory in the brain using criteria, but the actual memory is not stored anywhere. It just sends a signal back to our visual and temporal cortex, and then that signifies our memories that we're having, and that's not even identical. He talks about experience as an emergent property of the brain. A lot of people talk about it like that, but there's no meaning to that word. See, they're just throwing out words. Is kind of what Nietzsche's criticism of Kant was, by virtue of a faculty. And it's like humans never learn. They're just making the same mistakes over and over and over again. And Joe Rogan's just not, his thinking's not nuanced enough to figure any of this out. He did start interestingly talking about a counter argument to Brian Cox, where he's talking about the situation where the monkey types out the part of Shakespeare and then somebody shits on it. It's like there's a compounded improbability. It's not even like the probability that it types one word right. It's like you'd never get past one word because there's just always gonna, and that's an argument against incidentalism in general. Like, you're not gonna get incidentalism in a rigid law. Rigid law is slightly above incidentalism, but both of these things, incidentalism and rigid laws together, don't produce anything interesting because you get no asymmetry for free. There's one exception to this that I've talked about, and that's three-dimensionality. It's a truism. There's no way that anyone can give a further ground for three-dimensionality or three uniquely perpendicular orientations. If you ask why there's three perpendicular orientations, all you can do is repeat it. They say, well, there are only three uniquely perpendicular orientations. What else? So really, the problem of theoretical science is they're extending the method of a mechanic or a doctor. I mean, it's worked for a little bit. Like, they postulate certain things about molecules, and like their technology gets better, and they can find out things about molecules. They can observe them. But it doesn't work for the atom, because you can't observe the atom. You can't even observe the direct atomic relations. These are just, all you can observe is the arrays of direct atomic relations and the perturbations in them. And that's all we're actually observing, and then we're extracting symbols. I call it symbolic matter. We're getting like symbols of, as if there were atoms. But really it's all hollow. And if it weren't hollow, I talked about how that would create a Zenos paradox for the exchange of energy at a certain point in a previous podcast. They also project, I talked a lot about them projecting our macroscopic picture onto the all of existence and onto the microscopic. That is a common theme. Same with religion or theology, creating a hidden being. They're all repeating concepts and reducing concepts in the process of repeating. Like, when you create a hidden space-time medium, it's because you don't like gaps. So you're trying to reduce gappiness. And if you ever had a psychedelic experience, you can totally tell with your body movements, especially on psilocybin, that all your movements are discontinuous. There's no such thing as pure continuity in experience or in the world. They already know that there's no real contact. And even the things that are not contacting, they're composed of nothing in the first place. So it's like all existence is like a shell game, or a pre-existential disposition, or pre-existential simulation, because they were talking about simulation. I don't even know what that would even mean, with the way they're talking about it. Like there's a hidden computer or something, or a hidden designer. I'm just talking about how the explanations for existence aren't part of existence, and it's being simulated by something that's not part of existence. And you can look at what I work on. I try to lay out what all these are. It's obviously really complicated, but you can look at eternalnovelty.com and click on the Wiccan Taoism link, and that's, I call it that because it's really a hybridization, or Wittgenstein and Taoism are really precursors to everything that I sort of work on. All the Wittgenstein used to say things like, the whole modern conception of the world is founded on the illusion that the so-called laws of nature are the explanations of phenomena. He's also said things like, the nature of space and time lies outside of space and time, or things that are hidden are not of no interest to us. Everything lies open to view. There's nothing to explain. Things of that nature, and talking about the limits of logic, or logic providing the limits of existence. And that's how I try to think, with verification or conceivability, that if we can't verify it or conceive it, then it's not real. I have that idea, I exploit that idea a lot. I'll talk about that in later podcasts. But that's part of Wittgenstein too. It's just earlier Wittgenstein. People that don't know about Wittgenstein, I think of him as the philosopher. Little interesting notes about him. He went to kindergarten with Hitler, which people are like, what? Yeah, he was in his class. Also, he had 3 brothers that were musicians, and they all committed suicide. He's the only one that didn't commit suicide. He thought about it his entire life. He's not very happy, because he felt isolated. I mean, I feel like that. I mean, everyone's kind of on autopilot. They don't think about anything, including physicists. And no one can tell the difference. It's really depressing that it's almost like how people talk about animals, how they don't really have as much of a sense of like death and what they are, and like they're not tripping out about that. Whereas I think that humans don't think about what they are. Like, they just act and they judge. They don't think about why they're doing that or why they're talking. Especially like people that brag a lot, or they like to talk about what things they do. They're not even conscious of like the little rush of pride they're getting out of doing that. Not that it's bad, because it exists, but they're not even reflective about it. That it's in a sense imaginary, even though it's part of reality. I say pride is imaginary because you can see, if you want to think about those things, you can see sort of why this person's able to be this person. There's no asymmetry for free, meaning the fact that Barry Bonds can hit all these home runs and this little guy can't is obvious. But the same thing with mental faculties too. And the same thing for people that are good at capitalism.